Welcome to Lessons That Last, where a researcher and a teacher talk about what it means to make a lasting impact on students' lives. They unpack the stories former students shared about their memorable teachers and discuss how we can all make a greater impact on the people in our lives. Here's Julie and Laura.
Hello, and welcome back to the Lessons That Last podcast. I'm Julie Hassan, professor, researcher, and big fan of educators everywhere. And with me is my charming co-host,
Laura Estes-Swilly. I am a teacher, a writer, and a lover of all books.
So we have had to prepare ourselves for the story and the conversation today because this one gets to us.
Yeah.
And I think I've told this story at least 100 times and written it and spent 2 years kind of unpacking it and exploring it. And I still can't get through it without being emotional. So we're going to do our best.
Well, when you told me I had to read it, in my mind, all the last couple of days, I was like, okay, so Julie's going to read the story and I can get myself together. And then when you told me I had to read it, I was like, okay, well, Lessons That Last. They're going to see us ugly cry, both of us, because it is what it is.
We keep it real here. Mm-hmm. And people would be disappointed if you did not read the story, because that's a highlight of this podcast.
Well, and I think that people would be disappointed if we didn't feel this deeply. And I think anyone who hears it or reads it in the future is going to feel it deeply.
Yes, definitely the crew who listens to this podcast is going to feel this one. And I wanted to give a little context about it before we dig in, because this is the story that inspired the next book, the one that's coming out in June 14th, 2023. Pause, Ponder, and Persist in the Classroom will be released. And I did not intend to write another book over this past couple of years. I had just finished Safe, Seen, and Stretch, and it was in production when this particular story came to me. And it inspired this question that wouldn't let me go. So this question was about when challenges happen in the classroom, when a student does something that frustrates us, makes a choice that we aren't anticipating or certainly aren't welcoming and really kind of throws us off. There are teachers who can take that challenge, that problem, and somehow turn it into an opportunity to impact a kid's life. And I needed to know, how do they do that consistently? Mm-hmm. Like, how do they sort of push past their own emotions? Because we know when a kid disrupts a lesson, makes a choice that we wish they hadn't made, does something that maybe feels disrespectful, we're human and we have these emotions that come up around that. These teachers who can take that situation and instead of reacting and making it worse, calmly respond in a thoughtful way and make it better.
Yeah, it almost feels magical. But to me, when you dig into those teachers and get to know them, they are kind of magical as well. I think these are natural and real responses to harrowing situations, sometimes uncomfortable situations. And it's the depth of the person responding that allows them to respond in a meaningful way, in a teachable way, or in a way that creates big impact.
Yes. And even early on, kind of exploring this particular story that we're going to share today and that happened around this incident in the classroom, I knew it had something to do with emotional intelligence. Like teachers who understand and can regulate their own emotions. And I kept thinking, managing student behavior and managing a classroom has so much to do with managing ourselves.
Yes.
And whether we sort of jump in and escalate an already chaotic situation, or whether we make some conscious choices that de-escalate it. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. Totally agree. When we are facing a really tough job, which we face every day, and we are also in a low state of emotional energy, because we all have those days, all the buttons get pushed. And so you can step back and be like, why today? Why did they have to push all my buttons today when I was already feeling some kind of way? And that's why, because your buttons were exposed, right? And when you are emotionally strong or at your norm of emotional healthiness, emotionally regulated, those buttons don't get pushed because you've decided they won't get pushed. Mm-hmm. And I think that's such an important thing, especially for young teachers, not young in age, but young in time of service, to understand is you can and you must control your emotions when you're in the classroom, because they will take you for a ride if you let them.
And I think you're right. It's especially tricky for beginning teachers because you're still learning and you panic when something like this happens. Like, oh my gosh, I'm losing control. Here goes my lesson. Here goes the rest of the class. You're already outnumbered. You're not completely secure in your moves anyway. And when a student challenges you, it does bring up sort of that fear and panic.
Mm-hmm. And I'll say this is a strange connection for me to make. Maybe one of my students did a presentation today on Chat GPT. So using artificial intelligence by students and the difficulty that we're all having making sense of it. And I said, as an offhand comment, I've read on the internet that teachers use it to create lesson plans. And the class was like, that's interesting. 2 minutes later, he brought me his phone and said, look at this lesson plan. And it was beautiful. It was every bit of a lesson I would teach in my classroom, right down to minutes spent on each activity. It provided a summative and a formative assessment, so you have a choice. It was amazing. But what wasn't on that lesson plan was all of this that we're talking about: the energy, the focus, the emotional regulation, and the being able to respond to what happens in the room. Because anyone can write a really nice lesson plan, but it's all of the unknown factors that aren't on that page that Chat GPT can't help us with. And it just, you have to be there, which is, I think, why it's difficult for early career teachers. You have to be there to learn how to handle it. And that's part of what makes the first couple of years so exhausting as a teacher.
Right. And the beginning teachers I used to mentor would have this beautiful plan, and they were like so determined to stick to that plan no matter what, even when it was going, like, it could have been the most beautiful plan, but going off the rails. And they were, hook or crook, we're going to stick to this plan, and they couldn't adjust because they just didn't have the tools and the moves and the skills yet. And I made a connection with this I can't even remember, I think it was a blog, it may have been Corey Mascara, who talked about sitting by a river, and he was talking about peace. And when you're sitting by the river observing it, like, the river can be rough, or the river can be calm, or the river can do whatever, you're just observing it. You don't need to jump into the turbulent river and get swept away. And I think about that in so many situations in teaching and leading. Like, we don't have to jump into the turbulent waters. No matter what the river's doing, we can sit on the side and observe it and determine what we're going to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then you get the moments where your students become metacognitive and think, how do you stay so calm? And isn't that a beautiful teachable moment? Because I can teach you how I stay so calm, and we can teach a little bit of that regulation and keeping ourselves in check and responding appropriately to what's happening around us. And I think that's one of the beauties of this story, is that this is a teacher who obviously checked herself, who obviously asked herself questions before she responded. She didn't make decisions and sweeping statements. She looked closely at the evidence in front of her, questioned it, and decided on a course of action that would be the most kind and the most loving course she could find.
And so much of teaching is about developing trust. And so much of trust is predictability.
Yes.
Can our students predict how we're likely to respond? And if they can't, if our emotions have us kind of flying off here and there, and we're unpredictable, that's a trust breaker really quickly with young people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always want to know where I stand when I see your face. I always want to know where I stand when I'm sitting in your room, because you're like in charge of my world for X amount of time, whether it's an entire day in an elementary class or half a day when you switch, or an hour of time in a secondary classroom. You are in charge of what's happening to me in this environment. And so I want to know that I'm safe with you in all the ways.
And I know for our younger ones, our elementary kids, and probably for our high schoolers too, it's not just that the teacher might jump down my throat, right? Or the teacher might have some reaction to me. It is whatever happens to any of my classmates can make me feel unsafe. So how my teacher responds to the most challenging kid has an impact on me. And how much I trust that teacher.
Absolutely. You can see that on a team. You can see that in a family. When somebody is giving the leader a hard time, we have to figure out where we're going to align ourselves, right? Because nobody really stays in the middle on the fence. And if the teacher, the parent, the coach takes the authoritative, less than kind route, we have an automatic response to that, no matter who we are, no matter if we're the quiet one in the room or the loud one in the room who's going to speak up for our friend. We have a natural response. And I think that's adults as well. I think in a faculty meeting, we feel the same way. In a college classroom, we feel the same way. Because fair is fair, and we want fairness. We want to demand fairness. We're not always in the position to demand it. So if we see unfairness, it changes everything in the tenor of the relationship.
Yes. We are impacted by how the most struggling of us is treated.
Absolutely.
For sure. So a little history on this story from Marcus before you tell it. About, I'm going to say 6 years ago, maybe 7 now. We started on this journey. You were with me, always advising and supporting, trying to find out what teachers say and do that impacts students' lives long term, and started interviewing, over 600 people now about the teachers they remember, and finished collecting data in February 2020 and started writing. And I did not plan to finish collecting data right before COVID. That was just
luck.
Always the timeline. Dumb luck. And then started writing in March and April of 2020, which was a great time to have data collected and be writing. So during COVID, I wrote Safe, Seen, and Stretched because those were the themes that came out of that early research. And we'll link that book in the show notes. Promoted that book, loved all of the things that came with having published that book, had no intention of writing another book. And in that time, we moved from Lakeland, Florida, which is the setting of Safe, Seen, and Stretched, to Western North Carolina. Got through COVID here, moving during COVID that's a whole nother conversation. And once we started to sort of come out into the world again, I was at volunteering at a food bank and met this man, Marcus. And as you do with strangers, we started talking about our work. What do you do? It's a pretty typical question for a new friend. He was a marketing director, brilliant young man of color. And I told him about what I teach in my research and about the way we've been exploring teacher impact. And he said, I have to tell you about Mrs. Pope. And I had no idea in that moment that the story he was going to tell me about Mrs. Pope would send me on a whole nother journey to try to figure out what she did and how she did it. But it just wouldn't let me go. And I resisted it for a while. I thought, nope, I'm done. I don't need to start another research project. And when you hear the story, you will realize why. I just couldn't help it for a million reasons. So, Laura, will you share Marcus's story about Mrs. Pope with us?
I'm going to try. So that background information started giving me feelings in my face already. So bear with me. I teach AP Literature, and today was our exam. And one of the things that I talk about with them a lot right before the exam is the principle of catharsis. And the job of art is to create emotional release so we can release the feelings that we have inside, but we haven't quite figured out how to release them. And I think that this story is giving me catharsis. So join me. Mrs. Pope was my home economics teacher. I loved her class because of her kindness and because we often cooked. One day, we made chocolate chip cookies. After they cooled, Mrs. Pope said we could each eat one. I snuck 3 more in my pocket. I knew my teacher must have seen me when she asked me to stay after class. I expected Mrs. Pope to lecture me or write me a referral. Instead, she just asked, "Are you hungry?" I told her that my dad left a few months ago and my mom wasn't doing well. I told her that our electricity had been off for a while. She just listened. Then I noticed her gaze down at the spots on my shirt. I didn't expect her response. She offered to let me wash my clothes in the washing machine housed in the home economics classroom. I brought my clothes by the next morning. When I came back to get them, they were carefully folded and they smelled so good. Next to my clothes was a large brown bag with my name written on it. I peeked in the bag and I found bread, peanut butter, cans of soup, and other snacks. Throughout my high school years, Mrs. Pope checked on me. My clothes were washed in that home economics classroom more times than I could count. My teacher and the ladies in her church group were the only reason I ate most nights. Mrs. Pope is gone now, and I can't repay her for her kindness, but I try to pay it forward by volunteering in the local food pantry.
Oh, we just need a moment here.
Yeah.
Mrs. Pope, man. And when I first heard this story from him, it was just such a beautiful, sweet thing for him to share. I don't know that I really thought about it from the teacher moves perspective. I just think I thought about it from the human perspective, from kindness and grace and generosity and care. But when I thought about it more and more, I started to think about it really from this teaching perspective. And I started to think about how many kids get disciplined for things that are really things like this.
Yeah.
Hungry, needy, and whatever, angry. But as teachers, we're human. So when we've given this clear direction and a student defies our direction, we feel frustrated, disrespected, angry, all the things. And yet somehow she pushed aside all of that and just was in that moment with this kid. And I kept wondering, like, how does she do that? Like, how do you push aside the frustration and the disappointment and the feelings of disrespect when you've given this direction and a kid willfully doesn't follow it?
So I don't want you to give away your whole book that's coming out soon, but my hypothesis would be you are already starting as a beautiful, loving, and giving person who examines your choices in that moment. Am I angrier that this kid defied an absolute directive that I gave? Because she told them to only take one cookie, that must mean she had a use for the other cookies, right? Going to the principal, right. Maybe for secretary's week, something like that. Mm-hmm. So there was something. So, but she has to stop and examine and let her nature, her better nature, overtake. Am I right? Or am I on the right track with that?
I think you are right. And what I realized after hearing this story and then being driven by curiosity and needing to know, like, how do teachers do that? I started observing, like, the best teachers I know and asking a lot of questions. And when I saw things like this happen in the classroom, I noticed this pattern where they would just take a breath. Like you could see these teachers when something went down in the classroom for just a second. And I thought, that's it. Like, it's just a breath. It's stop, take a beat, take a minute, take a breath, take a pause. And I thought about it as a former teacher and as a parent. Every time I regretted the way I've responded to something, it's because I didn't take a breath, take a pause. Yeah. I just let those words tumble out and that reaction happen and let myself get driven by those emotions instead of taking a breath and just getting calm and then deciding.
That makes sense. And if you think about what the research says about how many decisions a teacher makes in a day, we know that in the time of that breath, and when you were talking about it, I was seeing myself. I have many times taken that breath. And that breath sometimes is a long one.
Sometimes you need the time. two or three breaths.
The million things flying through your mind in that moment are astounding. And I think that's why I saw it as you have to either give into your better nature or give into your sort of like visceral nature, the response, the feelings, because can you imagine all the things that were going through all those teachers you were watching take that pause? Mm-hmm. We probably couldn't even verbalize it if we talked about it right away. And of course, you wouldn't talk about it right away. You'd have to wait until that time had passed. And so you get a general idea, but I can't imagine.
And I think part of the key is in that breath, in that pause, you have to stay right in that moment because it's so easy to go to the past.
Yes.
Every time we do this, that kid, or this kid constantly, or why do kids have no like you could go back in history with this kid or all kids, or you can start to predict forward.
Right.
Well, now I'm not going to be able to do cooking anymore because kids can't follow directions.
Right. Or I'm not going to be able to trust this one.
Right.
This kid.
Yes. So there's something about taking that breath and just not revisiting anywhere. The past or going into the future or letting your brain just start spinning with all the tales that your thoughts can spin, and being right there with this kid and then getting really curious. Like, she asked a question. The power of a question.
That was not an easy question to ask either. I mean, let's be honest.
Right.
That's a hard question because you are now probing into a place where a kid really doesn't want you to probe, because no one wants to admit, yes, I'm hungry. because we don't have enough food in my house. That's a hard thing to say. And this was a high schooler. Mm-hmm. So even harder, right? Not like a little kid who just tells the truth all the time. He knew that he should probably keep that a little quiet. And so she asked, in many ways, what I think is the hardest question. And it was, she came out of the gate with it. Are you hungry? And you can imagine the tone, just the gentle, loving tone. I never met a home ec teacher who wasn't a beautiful soul.
Same.
And so that tone that was in that is probably what brought the truth from him. But she went in.
She did. And it's scary to ask a question like that for a couple of reasons. One, because if you ask and you get the answer, you have to do something with that information. And also because there's something that teachers and healthcare workers suffer from called empathy fatigue.
Yes.
Where you just feel the emotions when your students are suffering in some way. And we can only do so much of that before it wears us out.
Yeah, I believe that. I understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But she went there. Like, are you hungry? And in order to do that, you would have to push aside all the assumptions about this kid. He doesn't have self-control. He lacks character. He's a thief. All the things you could assume.
So I was thinking about two things while you were talking, especially about empathy fatigue. I started to think about the idea of toxic positivity, which is kind of a problem, I think, in a lot of places in the world, but definitely in education, we seem to be struggling with that a little. And then I was also thinking about Mrs. Pope and her pause and her ponder, and how her biases or lack of biases came into play. Like, what do we have to overcome of our own natural biases when we are taking that pause?
I love that you brought up biases because we all have them. And it's sort of like toxic positivity, right? We all have struggles, and pretending that we don't is not helpful.
Right.
We all have biases, and pretending that we don't is unhelpful. So I have to think she did the work that we all need to do in considering our own positionality, how we move through the world, how we see other people's experiences in the world. She had to have done some work to understand her biases. I mean, this was a Black student with a white teacher, so there's a lot there that we could unpack. But she clearly pushed aside assumptions about him.
Yes.
And we know that it's easier to make assumptions about people incorrectly when we come from different backgrounds and races and cultures and ethnicities and genders and all the things. So somehow she managed to push aside all that.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about the difficulty in asking that question. It would be hard to ask that question because you might feel like you're expressing a bias, right? Does a kid take a cookie because a kid wanted another cookie and that's a natural kid thing? And by the way, high schoolers are starving all the time. Trust me. Or do we ask the question and risk looking like we're making assumptions? There's so much at play in that question and in that pause.
Yes. I mean, it definitely was a risky question.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have to wonder, had she been observing him? Was there a reason?
Yes.
He said she noticed the spots on his shirt.
Right.
And this, he'd been struggling for a while before she asked him this question. So I have to wonder, did she notice some things that led her to ask this particular question in the first place?
Absolutely. And I'm sure she did, because like we said about home ec teachers, nurturers, she knew and she had noticed his clothes being the worst for wear. And he just saw her notice it for the first time. Like that was not news to her. So maybe that did make it easier. And she didn't have to filter through all of those things that I might feel like I had to filter through, because she already understood some of the things that were happening.
Yeah. It's such a powerful story about this powerful moment. And it made me think about all of the challenges I've experienced as a teacher in the classroom. And it makes you wonder, how many times did I make a false assumption about a kid? How many times did I decide on a consequence or, make a decision based on inaccurate information?
Right. And we count a lot on our support staff to know the answers to those questions. I have a really, really engaged relationship with our guidance department, because when I notice something, I check my perception with them first. I'm usually not the first one to notice or the first one to hear, because parents are so good about reaching out to guidance counselors. And so I might be the first one to ask about it, but they have the information and are able to share it, which is wonderful about the system we've created. And I hope it's that way in every school. But I know it's not always the same everywhere, because those kinds of interactions are difficult. And because there are so many kids who need so many things, it's not always as easy as washing clothes and a bag of food. Even if it's a bag of food a week or laundry every week, it's not always that easy.
Yeah. It's so important that someone does some asking and inquiring.
Yes.
Instead of just making assumptions. We can only make decisions as good as the information on which we base them. And the best information is not based on our assumptions. It's based on the information we get from kids and families. But they will only give us that information if they trust us. Like he clearly trusted her to say, yes, I am hungry. Here's what's going on.
Right. And you have to trust yourself, I think, enough to not just take the first answer. Right. Like I'm thinking about years ago, a kid who won a writing award, and I was very excited for her. And I expected her to be very excited too, because she was a writer and she was all about this. And when it was time to go and pick up the award, she was like, I'm not going to go. And so of course I wanted to know why. And the first answer was, well, it was just honorable mention. So it's not something I really want to do. And first response, are you kidding me? You didn't win in first place, so it's not good enough. Like that's what's in the head. So that's why the pause is important. And then I realized, I'm not sure I'm buying that. What else? And so I think we all have to get past that first response and probe, because it doesn't always unfold as easily as it did with Marcus. Even if they trust you, even if they've known you forever, and sometimes even harder, then they might not just open up and tell you what they really want you to know. You just have to probe a little kindly.
To say, Miss Estes Swilly, I don't have any good shoes to wear, or
and actually in the end it was, I don't have appropriate clothes for this. I don't have a dress and I am embarrassed.
Which is where the Persist comes in this framework. So all of those great teachers that I observed and interviewed and tried to figure out, how do we do this? It started with a pause, like check your emotions, become aware of how you're feeling, make sure that you're responding and not reacting, and then a ponder, ask some questions, push aside those assumptions, but then a persist. Because you're right, it doesn't get wrapped up in a neat little package with a bow most of the time.
Right.
It's And even when we are helping kids get on a positive trajectory, we know that's not a straight line up, right?
Right. Kids are complicated and adults are complicated. We are complicated, and we have to take that into account when we're having these interactions. And then families are complicated as well.
I mean, we're in messy work, difficult work. But as this story illustrates, life-changing work. Mm-hmm. That was a life-changing moment for him. And he continues to carry that and want to pay it forward, even though she's gone. It's just so beautiful.
Yeah. For me, the most beautiful thing about that story, well, maybe second most beautiful, because Mrs. Pope is just magnificent, is that you met him volunteering at a food bank.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so sweet. And maybe a good reason to talk to strangers,
right?
And to talk about teachers, because we were all once kids struggling with something in a classroom. And we all, if we were lucky, had a Mrs. Pope.
Yes.
Who was willing to push aside assumptions about us and ask some questions and persist with us through all our difficulties and help us become better people. Mm-hmm. And that's what the framework of the book was all about. These great teachers, it started with the inspiration of Mrs. Pope, but then all of the great teachers I got to observe and interview, and all of the former students who talked to me about their teachers, it was this framework of pausing, pondering, and persisting that emerged from that, which sounds simple, but it's not easy.
No, it's not. Nothing we do is easy.
No, but worth it. And I hope it at least gives teachers a framework they can think about, and maybe beginning teachers, kind of a framework they can use when they're trying to
get through the lesson,
deliver this beautiful lesson. And there's a little problem. There's a little kink in the plan, right? Maybe they can take a breath.
Well, I was just thinking too, while we were talking about the teacher pausing and pondering and persisting, and sometimes you have to really persist to get to the meat of the issue, of the behavior, of whatever's happening. What Marcus did, obviously he came from struggle at home, but you said he was a marketing executive.
Yes.
So there was college coming for him. There was, a trajectory in the workforce coming for him, which he became successful. And so he was going to have to persist. We have to persist. And the kids who leave our classrooms have to continue to persist. So that, to me, that persist has a little echo, because we're doing it so they can do it. And then they can become part of the world around us and make it a better place.
I love that you said that, because we're models always. They're watching us always. And when we pause and kind of check our reactions in favor of a thoughtful response, and when we push aside assumptions about other people and get curious, and when we persist, we model that for them as well.
Absolutely. And they are watching. And sometimes I think, especially maybe 9th and below grades, you don't always hear how much they're watching, right? Because they're not as metacognitive. And the little guys, you realize they're watching because everything comes right out of their mouths.
Yes, they repeat everything.
But it's not until later in their high school years that you really start to see and hear and read how much they actually are noticing the smallest, but also most important things that are happening around them, with the teachers, with their peers, with their administrators, with their parents. And they're choosing role models, and they don't even realize it until they've already done it.
Beautiful. Oh, Mrs. Pope, what an inspiration, and Marcus. Yeah. So thank you, teachers, for pausing, pondering, and persisting. We will link that book in the show notes if you want to check it out. Thank you for modeling that for your students, for helping them when they're struggling get back on their feet. Mm-hmm. We do not deserve you, but I'm so happy we have you. Have a wonderful week, everybody.
Bye.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Lessons That Last podcast. The story Laura shared today can be found on the Chalk and Chances website, along with many more stories and resources. Just visit chalkandchances.com. You can even take the quiz to find out what kind of memorable teacher you are. See you next Sunday for another episode of Lessons That Last.